If you guys enjoy this podcast, I'm going to do that thing that I thought I would never do and say, please, please, please like or subscribe to our show. When you do that, it tells everyone that we can keep making these episodes for you. It indicates that you're enjoying the show, that it's something that's worthwhile for us to do. We love talking to these authors. We love giving you access to these authors, and we love getting inside their minds and giving you a little sense of exactly how they approach their creative process. So, if you feel so moved, please, please like or subscribe to The Bookshelf with Jennifer Morrison. Nora, thank you so much for doing this interview. We're really excited to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
So, we're talking about Us Fools. And am I right that it just came out?
Yeah, September 17th. Yes. So
That's
about 2 months.
amazing. Wow. Okay. So, before I get into my questions, what would be your quick pitch of this book if someone was trying to consider reading it?
Yeah, I would say it's a tragic comic novel that spans a lot of years from about the 80s through 2009. That follows closely, mostly two sisters that have, their own take on America and each other. And I like to think of it honestly, like simply put, like a love story
Mm.
between them and their country, which in the case of the novel is America. And sort of the joke I tell myself is that like any good love story, there's tension.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of that that's present in this.
It's I think so unique. I think because of what you're saying in terms of the love story with the sisters, it's very rare to have that kind of a love story to be able to really dive into. Um, so I want to actually go back to what you just said about the book coming out. So I kind of want to start with what was that experience like? How did it go? What happened leading up to it? What is
Yeah.
that like?
Interesting to ask that at this point, right? Because it's just shy of 2 months out into the world, like officially. And so I've just returned home. This is the longest I've been home since then.
Mm.
Um, and it almost feels like old news, but yet it's only been shy of 2 months. And I think so when I was unpacking that, which is often what I do is unpack things. Or I
I
try
can tell in
to.
the way that you write.
Yeah, I know,
You
sorry.
definitely unpack.
Just there was so much that went into making the book, building a world, and then all the work that goes into pre-publication, um, such that the engines are all full steam ahead, and then the book is here. And it doesn't mean the work is done, it's not at all done, but there's so much foreground, right, that happens that yeah, it feels like it's been in my mind, it feels like it's been ever present for much longer than September 17, you know?
Yes, yeah. For you, it's been going on much longer than 2 months, but for the world, it's only existed
Yeah.
for 2 months.
So it's pretty wild. But yeah, I think that the book, of course, as it should, is taking on a life of its own. And, I'm further thinking about like in this process of like talking to people such as yourself,
Yeah.
um, like what all this sort of is about, really. Like even, yeah, the book, it
The
was
book
a,
feels incredibly relevant in terms of everything that's going on politically in the country. I mean, it's so interesting that there is so much love that Bernie has for her country, despite how hard some of the policies in the country have been on her life and her family. It's like such an interesting thing to like get into that turmoil with her and be like, oh, both things can coexist, which I think is really inspiring or a really inspiring concept to be taking in this moment. It's like so many people are so divided in how they feel about what's going on in the country and the politics and what decision and this and that, like, and and to see these characters who are so deeply impacted by the policies of that time still love their country so much, and I feel like there's something about that really, because I read the novel a few months ago. So weirdly, the novel has existed earlier for me because I got an advance copy and then reread the novel knowing we were coming up to this interview. And so it's really interesting to read that in two very different headspaces, like pre-election and post-election. And I thought, this feels so, not that there was any way for you to know this when you were writing it, but it feels so relevant for people to be able to kind of look at how those things can coexist. Because I think there's a lot of people who right now don't feel like you can love your country and also not agree with its politicians or its policies. Do you know what I mean? Like it's
I do. And I think that I'm going to try to like, this is a new bridge for me to be drawing at the moment, but so forgive me, it's going to be janky.
yeah.
But like, thinking about what loyalty is, and I think that in the case of this book and sort of the origin story of even them being Midwestern farmers, right? The fact that farmers often feel a very strong loyalty to the land
Yeah.
and to what they do, come what may, right?
Mm.
Come agricultural policy that rubs them down or brings them down, come storms that wipe crops away, come disease that or bugs, or come all of the things,
Yeah.
right? A farmer doesn't generally want to leave the land, and I guess something that we're all, maybe not all, but those in my community are wrestling with is what is the sort of line to draw here in the sand, right? What
Yeah.
is sort of the love and the loyalty, and what component of that is like myth making that is self-manipulative or sort of sadomasochistic, and what component of that is just actual, like a truth in the body.
Yeah.
You know what I
No,
mean?
but
And
it's so interesting you say that because one of the questions I had, well, not questions, but one of the thoughts that I wanted to kind of bring up to you is
yeah,
like, for so much of the beginning of the novel, I was sure that they had no other choice but to keep trying to farm, that Sylvia and Henry had to. And when there was suddenly this thing of like, well, we can make this deal with the bank and we can go to Chicago, I was like, wait, what? They could have
right.
just gone and done that a while ago. Like and I know it's there. Like I know that you did lay the runway for that, but like in my like emotional experience of connecting with these characters, I was like, they don't have a choice. They don't have a choice. They have to do it. They have to figure it out. And I was like, oh, they had a choice, but there
Mhm.
was this like deeper loyalty. And the practical side of me says, like, well, this is crazy. Why didn't they just go and do the thing that was going to give them a
Before.
better life sooner?
And it's interesting you even pointed out, because a lot of people who stayed they were sort of lucky, the family, eventually the Farron family in this book, eventually, for thinking or feeling like, even though it's a choice, they don't even sort of even feel like it's a choice, because they say they have no other choice.
Yeah.
But other people don't even feel like it's a choice.
Yeah.
Really. And people like think about it like this, like abusive relationships,
Mhm.
how it's a kind of common thinking of that, why can't you just leave? Or right, in the case of this book, why couldn't these hungry farmers just eat their soybeans?
Right. Yeah. It's a great line. It's like,
And I
oh
mean,
gosh.
that was on television. That's
Yeah.
real stuff. And so, I mean, so is domestic violence and women mostly not being able to get out of that cycle. But I guess I'm saying, again, janky bridge here, but um, there are these cycles that, even if torturous and seem obvious to escape, for people and for whatever we carry with us, are not easy to just leave.
Mhm.
And what the psychology is, emotional and otherwise, behind that, even historical, that's a big question. It's a looming question, and it looms
Yeah.
today, looms always.
Yeah. Do you consider this historical fiction?
Yes.
I mean, I assumed because I was like,
Yeah,
oh, this all tracks, like when I was like, because I mean, the crazy thing is, I grew up in the Chicago suburbs,
I know.
and I had never heard of the farming crisis. I mean, that's what's so crazy.
You in Evanston, Jennifer?
No,
Remind me where
I was in
you live.
Arlington Heights, but
Okay.
I
Yeah.
ended up, I mean, I went to Loyola, which is right, sort of south of Evanston. A college boyfriend went to Northwestern, so I spent a lot of time in Evanston. But yeah, so and you're from there as well, or no?
Well, I went to school in Chicago, and so I was in Chicago proper for about 7 years, but my parents are both from the Midwest.
Oh,
So
got it. Okay.
my mom had, by the time I was born, I think there were 3 farms between her and her sister. Um, and then now there's one, but that's like,
Oh, interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. So it was in your family history, the Midwestern farms. Yeah. So I mean, I just kept thinking how different it would have been if there was Wi-Fi and social media in the 80s. Because I just thought, I mean, I'm a fairly educated person who reads and
Right.
used to read the news. I literally got to a point where I was like, I just can't because I might die. But and so, I was like, how did I not know that this whole part of the country that I lived in was suffering like this? Like it was so eye-opening. I actually felt like ashamed to have not known about it.
But you know what's funny is that at the time, I think people did know. It's only that, and I don't have the answer to it because I've been asked this before, like, why doesn't it sort of, sort of every once in a while crop up? Oh my God, I can't, never mind, pop up in our collective imaginations, right? Like, why aren't we reminded of it more often?
Yeah,
But I just, the only thing I can ever point to is just it's a part of the country that people just aren't really reminded of often anyway. It's sort of
interesting.
neglected. In the sense that it's not like it's not it's not, even though they're like the best restaurants in the world, I think in Chicago and a
Oh
million
yeah.
different, such a great music scene and theater and you name it. Um, it's just not New York City or it's not Los Angeles. So it falls in
Right.
the, um, anyway, I think that people obviously who lived through it that were affected directly remember, but it's just not something that is on the surface of our collective imagine like memories at the moment.
Yeah. Well, and I found it so interesting too that it's like what seems to, and maybe you can fill in the blanks here because I'm sure your research is far deeper than the way that I'm understanding this, but that it seems like there were policies in terms of embargoes with Russia that kind of started this trend that was really tough on the Midwestern farming community. And so I could see how, the LA and New York news would be like, all right, we're being tough on Russia, the bad guys. Do you know what I mean? Like, and not at all really understanding the repercussions of what that actually did to our own country and the farming in our own country, and man, it's so all of this is so complicated. There's just so many domino effect results of
There are in contradictions,
yeah,
and I think too, like farmers were told to produce more. They were told to glean more yield per acre. So to plant more, to produce more. And then the shiftaroo was, it tanked. And so all of that product had nowhere to go. So it's sort of like, yeah, they're just, I mean, and maybe that's part of going back to that like mythology or myth making and what to believe and what not to believe. And how much are we, how much self deception is involved often with this myth making
yeah,
machine, right? Like there are just these contradictions at play,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And yeah, so I think, and even thinking about, yeah, I think when in my research, when Russia kept popping up or the Soviet Union, it just was ringing around like a marble in my mind, like because I would turn off my work zone and go and make food, turn on the radio, and it was just like Putin this, Putin that, and I'm like, wait, I just never felt like anything was ever off.
Yeah, wow. It's so crazy. We just stay in these like it's like different variations of the same crisis.
It's kind of a loop-de-loop,
Yeah.
yeah. I want off the ride, Jennifer, not to
I
sit.
know. I mean, I think the problem is, well, not problem. I think what is making everyone feel uneasy right now is that we all kind of want off the ride, but what does that mean? You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, because it's like we know what the ride is, even though we might disagree with it, and it's might be corrupt and it might not be great in some ways, but at least we know what it is, right? So then it's
Mhm.
like when you're asking to get off, which a lot of this country is, it's like, well, but yeah, but what are the rules to that, and what does that look like, and what form does that take? You know, it's like so nebulous and unknown, you know?
I agree. And also like to that point, right? Like what is our responsibility? Like, so do we do those that can pull up stakes and like move to Canada?
Right.
Let come what may to all of those that don't have that opportunity really suffer.
Yeah.
Like it's one of these things like, is this the moment where the country needs us most?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well,
So it's
I mean, I think ultimately too, it's like, I think it's the moment we have to figure out what people actually need. And I don't mean to make
like,
this interview
I
political,
know, sorry.
but no, I mean, I mean, the book is inherently has a political element to it, but like, we just need we like as a whole, like not even thinking about sides and Democrats, Republicans, or like anything.
Right.
It's like, what do people really need? Because clearly that those needs are not being met, or we wouldn't be in
100%
this position. Do you know what I mean? Like,
agree.
and that is, I think that's the most important thing to try to figure out. It can't be like we won and you lost, or you lost, you won and I lost. You know, like it can't be sides anymore. It's like we have a massive country with hundreds of millions of people who want to be able to afford groceries, pay for
Yeah.
their rent, buy a home someday, have children if they want to, keep their children safe, get them well educated, give them a chance to be set up to have a nice life. Like that's like the core stuff that somehow we have gotten so distracted on in all sides with all parties and whatever, like with all these other things. And it's like the bottom line is we're not taking care of those core needs. So
No.
like the country and I think the political organizations need to figure out on both sides how to take care of those needs, because
Yeah.
until that is taken into consideration, we can't get to the other stuff, which we need to get to. Do you know what I
Right.
mean?
Right. And the whole point, that I think you're making and that this book is attempting to like grapple with is people are hurting.
Yes.
And that pain is very real.
Yeah.
I think that I think that that does need to be addressed. And I think that when it's not taken seriously and when it's taken too lightly, you get into a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Um,
I agree. I completely agree. And I feel like this is such a beautiful, I mean, it's a beautiful read in general, but such a beautiful read for this moment because I feel like these two sisters and the complexity of their love for each other and sort of the yin and yang that they are, they're kind of two sides of one coin. And there's times where you almost can't tell them their thoughts apart. Like there's times where you're like, Bernie is so Bernie and Joe is so Joe. And then there's also times where you're like, they're kind of
mhm.
morphing into one in some way, and in a way that's like exciting and super interesting. And I just think that the intimacy of that relationship is such a beautiful way to kind of have your thoughts provoked about these bigger global issues. I mean, that's one of the things that I was really taken by is that it's an incredibly intimate book that is hugely globally relevant. Do you know what I mean? Like, and it's very rare to have such an intimate story feel so big.
Totally. And I think that was definitely a challenge in a good way for me as a writer to kind of to work on that because I knew that I wanted a closeness because I knew that in my lifetime I was moving further and further away from like feeling something, feeling
Mm.
really. And I feel like these characters, there's a lot of feeling and a lot of closeness and a lot of rawness and
Oh
depth.
yeah.
And also, but they're situated in this country. And so I think that working on having those things like be in tandem in a piece in the form of a book, of this novel as fools was what I was after. So
Yeah.
I'm glad that that you could see that and feel that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought a lot too about just like Sylvia, the mother. It's so interesting they call their parents by their first names
I
because
know.
it's, in Bernie's perspective, but which I love. I mean, it tells you a lot about Bernie. But the way Sylvia is like determined to keep her young daughter's eyes open to the way history has treated women and the way that even the women in her family have suffered or struggled in certain ways and have had double standards and then the bigger implications of like religions and politics and all the things and the way that like women have just had to fight and fight and fight to just have the same well, I haven't even gotten there yet, but trying to fight to have the same rights as men. And I just thought, man, it's so interesting because you could feel the pressure on these little girls of just
Mhm.
knowing that.
Yeah.
I thought, I don't know which way is better. I mean, obviously, we were just talking about both of us having daughters, and it's like, I was very unaware of that stuff as a kid. That stuff that I started to learn as I was reading more in high school and especially going to college. And it was like I was more evolved as a person by the time I was starting to realize those things. And in a lot of ways, my parents protected me from those thoughts when I was a kid or from those realities when I was a kid. And I think I appreciate from my personality that that's the way that it unfolded for me. But I don't know what's right or wrong or if there is a right or wrong there. But I just thought, man, you can feel these poor little girls just shouldering so much information at such a young age. Do you know what I mean? Like that's a lot.
It is a lot. I think, you know, like everyone kind of comes at this information differently. And like for my younger life as a child, my mom was like a single mom. And I think that there was I don't know if it was an urgency, but a different kind of urgency. There was a toughness in having two children and working full time and
Wow.
all of that stuff. And I think, I hadn't thought much about my own personal trajectory in terms of writing this book at all until, like, again, going through these processes of talking and chatting about it with people and sort of realizing and remembering, yeah, my mom did when I turned, I don't know, I could have been as young as 7, give me a cassette recorder and, give me Heart and say, this is a female rock band you need to know.
Mm,
She didn't say why, except that she made it very clear that it was important.
mm.
So there are like these tidbits just in my own, like recipe of self that were sort of dropped for me or throughout my childhood. And I guess so for me, it doesn't feel unorthodox per se. And I think that when I decided to set these sisters during the Midwestern farm crisis in the 80s, I think that there was no way for their parents who are part of this community that was being sort of devastated for them to not um, address that with their kids and their kids too. I mean, without a ton of distraction because there wasn't the
Oh
internet.
man, exactly. There's no
They're like
tablets, there's no
seeing all this
screens.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. And then also, if the characters didn't say anything, I wouldn't have had much to write about, probably.
Oh no, and I'm not suggesting they shouldn't have known. It
No,
was
like just
more just
thinking
that I
about
could
parenting.
feel the weight that they carried for having
Yeah,
known. Do you know what I mean? Like that it
yeah,
was it made me think a lot about like how much it feels important for young girls to understand what they're up against. Do you know what I mean? Like that does
totally.
feel important. But it was I could feel the way that it I think especially with, well, at least Bernie's perspective of Joe,
Yeah,
like I feel like,
yeah.
I didn't realize until oh, I can't think of her name, but Bernie's talking about the woman she dated for a bit who she didn't treat very well. And it's the
Mm-hmm.
first time I feel like Bernie acknowledges her own offenses. And
Yeah.
it was like it was up until that point, like in my mind, Bernie's sort of like the perfect one who's like keeping it all together for. And I was like, oh wait, she's an unreliable narrator. Like,
Yeah.
she's done
Yeah.
some
And I
crazy
think
shit too.
totally. And I think that to that point, right, like she maps herself as like an opposite image of her sister as a way to like understand the contours of her identity,
Yeah.
which is
Hmm.
just also interesting too. Just, I mean, not to like harp on myth making, but identity is in that family tree, you know.
Totally.
Um, and I think that there's a lot of that. Like, and to some degree, we're probably all unreliable narrators if the studies about memory are accurate, right? Like, I mean, we're pretty yeah, all
Yeah.
over the place. So yeah, I think that yeah, I think that they bounce off of each other's reflections. It's interesting that and thinking about having daughters such as we have, just how do we explain these things? And I was, for whatever reason, it called to mind. My daughter's now into saying hi shadow. So like she
Oh
sees
yeah,
her
yeah, we do
shadow
that
and it's
too.
like,
That's so
yeah,
funny.
it's so
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
But
Totally
I,
fascinated with shadows. Yeah.
100%. And again, it just is like, what, I don't know. Maybe that's too woo woo, but there it is, your shadow, your
Yeah.
first like, projection of, right?
Yeah. So for you, when you started this process, like where does the kernel start for you? Do you start with a character? Do you start with the theme? Do you know, like talk me through sort of going, I'm going to write a novel and here's where I'm going to start.
Pretty much that's what it was. No, I'm just kidding. I was like, I would write a novel and I woke up and I wrote it and I was done and I went to bed.
Gosh,
No,
that would be great.
I wish. No, this started, at first I thought it was strange to say, but I've been learning it's not strange at all. That it started as like audio, almost hallucinations. Like I heard them and I did hear them simultaneously, them being
Wow.
Joanne and Bernadette, the two sisters in the novel. And yeah, I think that basically like, this sort of timeline as I heard them, and sort of felt their presence. I didn't totally know what any of it meant. I sort of ignored it and went about my life, living in Chicago at the time. And they just were sort of persistent and they are rather, pesky and
Yeah,
persistent.
yeah, they're there.
They're there. They're there. And so yeah, then I just sort of started investigating them, and it was definitely a question of is this one person? Is this two people? Are they twins?
Mm.
Are they, what is happening here? And yeah, and then, through sort of forming all of that, I realized there are age differences. I realized who was older. I was able to parse them out, but also see how they were similar, but also see how they used each other to be different.
Mm, that's cool.
You know, but yeah, to answer your question, I heard them.
So it started with character and
A
then
character, there you go. Yes.
sorry, I don't mean to be
I
reductive. I'm just
know, I'm so grateful. I appreciate it. I can be so rambly.
no, I want all the pontificating. So yeah, for you with this, it started kind of with character, and then so once you have their voices sort of delineated in your head, and you like you were saying, you're okay. This one's older, this one's younger. This is how they kind of define themselves based on how they see each other. So then when do you know it's the 80s and it's a farming crisis and that you're also going to be able to like weave in these kind of huge global themes into a story about
Mhm.
two sisters' love for each other?
Yeah. Well, really simply, like, thinking about craft, right? So
Mm.
characters first, then it was where are they? And then it was a setting. And so, um, I don't know that I know exactly what I'd had in mind, except that I definitely knew they needed a home. And I thought the Midwest was a great place to put these two sisters who sort of feel not untethered, but a little bit mm, like they didn't fit in LA and they didn't fit in New York. They fit in the middle,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and they could dream about those places. And that was
Mm.
part of the mythology too, right? Is like, who doesn't want to, be a part of the new frontier and move to West Hollywood or whatever, Santa
Yeah.
Monica. Um, anyway, but yeah, so when I settled on that, the Midwest, then I got into like, well, when are they born? And so I kind of modeled them off of my own history, like my trajectory. Not exactly, but semi, because it was something I could speak to if I needed to.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and then that's when I was like, oh my gosh, there was this massive farm crisis, and and then I started asking people, and no one really talked on it. And I was just like, well, this is so weird.
Yeah.
Um, but then, then I started doing more research, and I have all these books that I got from the library, and of course, a lot of Wisconsin and all of these states have records of all this
Right.
stuff. And so I was able to, thanks to the internet and thanks to public libraries, take a deep dive into the time period.
And when you
Um,
go into that research phase, you're not yet like actually writing the novel, you're kind of just building the world, or is it kind of
yeah,
happening simultaneously?
it's happening simultaneously. And it kind of, to be honest, for me at least, anyways, there was a period in my life where I was given the great gift of having sort of unlimited time to work on this book. And
Mm.
it's a long story as to why. Like it wasn't a great residency or anything. It was like a personal story. And in any case, I had the gift of that moment was that I did have this time to just dive into this
Oh,
book.
interesting.
And so I kind of just didn't sleep. I mean,
Mm.
you could even ask my husband. I mean, I would try to sleep but wake up constantly, and I had a notebook next to the bed and I was just constantly taking notes. The engine was just rapid fire, and so yeah, it was simultaneous, and never ending.
Mm.
And I think gratefully, because the time is a very rough patch in general, like with our personal life. And so I got to but also a beautiful patch because I got to work and
Yeah.
focus on this novel.
Was your husband having sleep issues with you jumping out of
Yeah,
bed
I'm
to
sure he
write?
was. He's Nora, so screw.
It was your revenge for his snoring. You're like, you're gonna
Yeah,
snore, I'm gonna
exactly.
write all night.
Exactly. He's Nora, I write. Uh,
Is your husband also a writer?
yeah, he is.
Oh, that's helpful.
It is. It is. He's my first and sometimes even only reader. Yeah, it's really
Oh,
nice.
wow. How
Yeah.
amazing. And so, okay, so now you've done the research, we had the characters, find them, have the research, go down that rabbit hole. How long did it take for sort of from like start to finish with the
Hmm.
first draft, not like the complete draft, but the first draft?
Okay, the first draft. Yeah. Yeah. God, that's a good question. And I wish I had I'm, to be honest, like not the best with time. So for first draft, a while. I mean, even the second draft was a while
Oh,
because
interesting.
the agent was like, hey, Nora, and this speaks to what I was just saying, we need a timestamp, she said.
Oh, wow.
She's like, let's, before we send it out into the world to potential publishers, we need to have a timestamp here. What do you think about looking back, right? Like what happens if Bernadette looks back in time and tells,
Mm,
and I was like, okay,
mm.
yeah, good idea. And what of course, like the truth of it is that was present all along. I don't know why. Sometimes it's just I'm slow to see things that are already there, you know?
But isn't that just the truth when you're creating something? It's like if you were
Maybe
looking at
so.
it for someone else, you could make that suggestion, but when you're in it, it's just so much harder. It's like,
Sometimes. And I mean, it was like such a beautiful bow on the top of the gift, just so neat and like, important and like straightforward. And I just thought, well, yeah, oh my God, yes.
well, and
So
also
that's
just
why
that
the
she's
novel
like,
starts.
the current version of Bernie is struggling with this idea that Joe wants to have a child. And,
Right.
that's so loaded. With maybe subconscious jealousy of being replaced in some way and
Totally.
feeling left out, all these things. And so
100%.
it's like all of the storytelling of the going back becomes even more like doubly loaded. It's not just learning those things as if they're happening as they're happening. We know we're seeing it through Bernie's POV looking back. And we also know that why she's telling us these particular things is loaded to
Right.
help support her case, which is I'm freaked out that my sister wants to have a child. And
Totally.
so
And she's getting on a boat in Alaska,
yes.
with someone named Cicero. Like, I
Yes.
mean,
Oh God, I know. But
so
that I was like, oh my God, I'm so stressed.
yeah, yeah, like breaking out in hives. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the point of this to, have everyone break out in hives. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I mean, I think it was really a brilliant observation of someone or from someone such as Martha, my agent, who is looking at this book and being like, kind of like, babe, comma, babe being me, it's there,
Yeah.
pull out and implement that
Yeah.
point of view, that structural device. And so I did that. And that was also really cool, right?
Yeah. Was that in the first
Um,
draft or was that not until the
that
second
was second
second
draft.
draft? Interesting.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Which is why, like, my mind, when you ask that question, almost turns to that pivotal moment. So I can't remember too much. Of course, I remember some, but I don't know for how long that first draft took. But I, more importantly, to me, anyways, think about the structural shift
Yeah.
that happened with my agent and deciding to implement
What a great
that.
agent, though. I mean,
Yeah,
that's like a
totally.
really astute suggestion.
No kidding. Yeah. So with that, then it took longer. Like then it was probably because then from there, it was like an accordion. It went out and it went in and went out
Mm.
in until I could recalibrate the book. Because once I did that, once I had established and she was looking back and she was pulled off the side of the road, in the Midwest, from a snowstorm, right? She is in the now in this way, and the now is a different thing. Like, what does the carpet smell like? What does the room feel like? How many bodies have been through that space? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
totally.
then you build that up, and then yeah, there's just like a balance.
Yeah.
Sweet, salty.
And then, so, at what point in the like where was the novel once you actually like found a publisher and an editor and you know what I mean? Like you had your agent and you have your husband reading obviously as you're going. I always feel for partners. I'm like, my husband is a saint with the amount of like things I put him through. But
You know, so
but so once you sort of hand it over to the person editing, which was one of our favorites, $2 Radio in this case. I love Eric so much. We just love their taste over there. But where was it then versus like what the process was like working with Eric to get to the other side of that?
yeah. So I mean, I feel like Eric and I worked really, really well together. And we both kind of geeked out. I'd say that where it started with him and where it ended is not massively different. I'd say the major things that took place were both, him sending me notes that were sort of simple edits, and then me doing my annoying Nora Lange thing where I'm like, oh, but this thing should shift and come over here, and doing that. And then sending it back and him being like, yeah, good shift. And then what about, and then sending it back. And then, being done with those sort of larger shifts, to like minutia, like to like small things. Like I would joke about how we would be editing out aspects of the novel that we thought were just unnecessary, even if fun, even if
Yeah.
fun.
Is that
To
hard though?
read.
Like, is it hard to let go of those moments, or does it feel
You
okay to just
know,
kind of clear it
it
out?
is. And especially when you get on a roll, it was like it's like we were in like Freaks and Geeks or something. We were just get kind of like blitzed. I mean, we were sober, but like kind of blitzed out and like send each other notes. And he'd be like, hey, did you know that the owner of Taco Time was making beer in barrels and like rolling it around in his parking lot? I mean, and then it was like, but Eric, are we editing or are we adding? And it was
Right,
just
yeah. Are we adding stuff? Or are we be taking some away.
And so, again, I mean, but I think that in the end, when I look back on it from today, from this moment, right? What's today, November 15th, at 2:40 p.m. talking with Jennifer Morrison. Um, I see that as like part of the charm of the book, that you still can feel that playfulness in it.
Oh, I agree. I totally agree. Especially with, going back so often to that attic where they played so much, even
Yeah.
though the subjects they were sort of dealing with in their play were so big and kind of heavy in some ways, there was like a real sense of joy and playfulness that like permeates the book all the way through.
Yeah, like even when you remind me of the attic, right? The attic space where they are when they're younger. Um, Joanne struggles with insomnia, and even as she's like counting sheep, because that's what everyone says to do. And I don't
Mhm.
know how many of your listeners, or if you've ever tried counting sheep to
Oh
bark,
yeah.
I just tend to like, it's like annoying when it doesn't work, and I'm just like,
Well, and also
this
just, I
should be
mean, for
counting.
me, there's just too many things to decide about,
Right.
like how many sheep are there in the first
I
place? And
totally,
like,
totally.
like what kind of field are they in? Is it light? Is it dark? Like,
Yeah. And
let's
then
set the scene.
one falls, and then the other one has to like help it. I mean,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
even that. And then I'm not sleeping. The
No, you're
whole,
definitely not
the whole
sleeping.
point is that I'm not sleeping, and I'm doing this dumb thing that like I've been raised to think is going to like lull me into sleep, and it's completely doing the opposite.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess those sort of charms, right? Yeah, like charms on a bracelet, those little bits of those pops of color and joy, exist in this book. Um, Even if some of them are like sort of psychedelic and some of them are ridiculous or
Yeah,
dire.
yeah, but it's so playful. There's like a playfulness, I guess, to the way Bernie perceives life, so
Yeah.
that really comes through. It was interesting because like when I was trying to write my like little synopsis review, whatever you want to call it, for the book club, I was like, it's so hard to articulate exactly how much joy and fun is in the book because it seems like there's these big heavy subjects, which they are legitimately there. But I never felt like a heaviness while reading the book. I
Mhm.
felt like such a light, like I felt that I was aiming towards something hopeful, even though there was a lot for these girls to go through.
Yeah, and I think I don't know why this is making me think of this, and hopefully I'll be able in my janky bridge way make the bridge
Yeah.
between the two thoughts. If I can get the sentences out of my mouth. But I feel like, um, it's taken so long for me to find a kind of confidence in my voice. And I think
Mm.
that it made me think, well, why is that? I was thinking about this earlier today, actually. Um, but I think that's why I was such a big reader when I
Mm.
was like, well, forever. There's a quiet space when you read and you can go into it. And there's like a connection that can be made, and an intimacy that can be found. Um, and I think sometimes I feel like this is a book that's trying to like, take that feeling and put it like almost like regurgitated back into a book, like just like
Oh,
twofold.
like what
It's
you've
like
taken
folding,
from books, you're sort of giving back,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
like refolding
Mm.
it in to like
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
book
yeah.
itself. Which might be too meta of a thing to say, but I was just thinking about like that, like thinking about, how, yes, these little bits of joy to what you were kind of getting at and these sort of larger macro issues at play, right? These global issues. But I think that the intimacy is ever present and super important. The tie between the reader and the content of the book
Yeah.
and having that quiet space.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the same, if you were to give the prompt of what the synopsis of this book is to a different author, it could be like a very heavy dirge. Do you know what I mean? Like you could be like, oh God, and like it just never felt that way from the get-go. And, you were just mentioning, finding feeling confidence and finding your voice as an author. And I'm curious about
Hmm.
how do you know? You know what I mean? It's, I like I've been writing and rewriting this screenplay for 3 years now. And it's like, I think I found it. And then I'm like, oh no, it's not this at all. And I completely take it apart. And then it's like, and then I'm happier with the next thing. But then I'm like, but when am I going to take this thing apart? And, so it's like, when do you, like, are there indicators to you, or is it just a gut feeling? Like when you look at something and you go, this is it. Like, I know this is it. I feel right about it. I'm not saying that there's never an ounce of insecurity about something, but just like,
When do you say it's
how
done?
would you articulate feeling the confidence that like this is it?
You know, I'm gonna do a shout out to my brother here because we did a family event um not too long ago. I guess it was like 2 weeks ago now. And we were talking about the creative process. My brother makes wine.
Oh, amazing.
And yeah. And I love my brother. In any case, we were talking about this question,
Yeah. How do you
how do you
know?
know when
Yeah.
you're done? How do you know when the wine is done and you need to stop
Yeah.
tinkering? Um, and he was like, yeah, it's when I've tried everything.
Mm,
I've had a question, I've tried to answer it, or
mm,
I've thought of something and I've tried it out, or I've, done this or done that, and I've tried everything and I feel like I've given it my all.
mm.
And I thought, well, yeah, cluck, yeah, Jessie Lang. That's how I feel. You kind
Yeah.
of like when you've just kind of given it everything, and there actually isn't more. I mean, there's always more, but that more is italicized.
Yeah. Well, it's like the Chanel thing.
Um,
When do you get to the point where you take off the last thing you put on instead of putting
yeah,
new
exactly,
things on?
exactly, exactly. Um, or when you just screw all the other versions of their perfume and stick with number five,
Right.
you
Who
know?
needs more than that?
No one. It's the classic. But yeah, so yeah, I think, and that rang true for me. I don't know if
Yeah.
it's applicable to any like writer, but I think I guess, and maybe it's applicable to other things like a marriage or anything. When do you know in something it's time to sort of say peace to something,
Mm,
or let it rest for
yeah.
good, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it is when if given it, if certainly for me for this book, I don't have more to give it.
Right. It feels, yeah, you've given everything in every way.
Yeah,
And
I exhausted myself for sure.
oh, really? What was the process of recovering from that? I mean, just psychologically, it's a
Giving
lot.
birth, no, I'm just kidding.
Sorry, what?
I said giving birth, but
Oh, right.
which is like the truth, actually, but makes no sense.
Whoa, so you finished the book right before you had the baby?
No, I think I'd had the baby. I had the baby and I was editing with Eric. But yeah, I mean, still editing. Yeah, I mean, but the book was done, but I mean, going on to edit with Eric and our process, Sylvia had been born. Yeah.
Wow.
So, but even still, just sort of like one layer of depletion after another. But
I talk about
but
having nothing left at
renewal.
that point. My God.
Renewal. I should add renewal too, because
Yes.
like there's something, and there was a study that came out, and I remember probably at like midnight, a friend of mine who also has two young children sent me, I only have one, but she has two, sent me this note that was like, have you read this? That like we actually reverse, like that giving birth when you're an older woman, you're genetically like actually renewing your cells such that your
Yeah, I think there's
your
some crazy
youthfulness.
statistic that you are much more likely to live to be 100 if you have a baby
Yes.
after 40.
So renewal. So like
Yeah.
again, it's a depletion renewal sort of thing, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I felt that. I definitely felt that. I feel like, it's interesting because uh, you hear all the hard stuff about being a parent out there, and
Mm.
you don't often hear the good stuff, which I think is
Oh,
so
right.
interesting. It's like you do. I mean, people say, "Oh, it's the hardest but best thing I've ever done," and that sentence doesn't make sense until you have a child, and then you're like, "Oh, that's exactly right." But like I can't even explain like the way I feel life surging through me
Totally.
when I hold my child or care for her in some way or do some dumb little activity together with her. It's it's unlike anything else. There's
It
no
really-
other relationship in the world like it, and it actually made me, I've thought a lot about like my previous relationships before my husband since having a child, because I thought, oh, this is what I was looking for. I
Mhm.
was I was looking for this kind of love, and I didn't know that the only place you could get it is with the person, like a version of it with the person who's really your person. It can't just be, someone who's almost your person. And you can't even fully get that until you have that child with that person and you go, "Oh wow, this is a different kind of intimacy and a different kind of like regeneration of your spirit that
Totally.
that like somehow my soul craved, and I didn't know that the place I needed to put that craving was like to have a family someday."
Totally. And I think, I don't know how this works exactly. It's like having your cake and eating it too, but it's both outside yourself and from yourself.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like surreal, real, like in the sense that this child, at least my child, in the way that I feel, she's her own person and she's been her own person, you know, long before she even put her feet on this planet,
Yep.
you know?
Yeah.
And so while I am a part of her making, myself and her father,
Sure.
she's her own creation. And that's such a beautiful, like, thing, right?
Yep.
That she's both of me, but separate, like so, so separate.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I see the same thing. I feel the same way, it's just like it is very hard to articulate.
Yeah, 100%. And it's very, very cool.
Oh my
Like,
God, it's the coolest. It's
it's
like
the
it's just the coolest. Like
it
it's
really is.
oh man, every day I'm just like, God, I feel so lucky. I feel so lucky.
It's really cool.
Yeah. So how was the process of actually traveling with this book and talking about it? Did you feel like people react differently to it in different parts of the country or different parts of the world? Or, what was your experience of putting this into the world and letting it have a life of its own after having all this intimacy with it for so long?
Yeah, that it's given people joy, that you can set out to do something, in my mind, like that's trying to do something special, which is to like reach people. Maybe all books are that, but I think different books can have different intents,
Oh, for
for
sure.
good reason. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like mine, yeah, I think just like films, just like anything, like,
Yes.
you can watch a movie and it's a rom-com. You can watch a movie and it's Bergman, Seven Seals. They're totally different things.
Yeah, it's like hard
And
to
that's
believe that they're
great.
all movies because they're all
Yes,
so
exactly.
different. Yeah.
Um, so I feel like this one was trying to speak to something innate and special.
Mm,
Um, and also was weirdly trying to both speak to it, but also like listen to it.
mm.
And I think that that seems so far from people I don't know to have resonated, and that's very beautiful. And I think also uh, what people pick up on, right? So whether that was like Jane Smiley in the LA Times mentioning, making the narrator making meaning out of a traumatic childhood, like oddly, I never considered it a traumatic childhood.
But
So,
it
so
is. I know, but that's also where the sort of hope and the joy and the sort of like childlikeness that really like pervades the book is like you almost have to remind yourself that she's had a traumatic childhood. It's like because she has chosen to survive it by making meaning out of it in such a beautiful way.
yeah, and I think, well, it's interesting too. Like I think because maybe too, it's maybe again, this is a janky bridge, but like when people say parenting is hard, but there's joy in it too.
Mm.
Like, see the interesting about that sentence, right? It's starting with like parenthood is hard, and then it ends with but the
But
comma
there's
there's
joy.
in it too. So it's like there's a traumatic childhood comma, but like there's the story of survival. I almost I almost just focus on the latter,
Mm.
like that it's just more important to me that there are stories about like, regeneration, like in sort of like
Yes.
this thing, but not because I'm avoidant of the quote trauma. And
No, but I
maybe,
mean, it's also, I
maybe
mean, it goes
I,
back to the farming, right? I mean, it's like the perfect metaphor for all of it, right? It's like
Yeah.
there's just so much work and sometimes trauma that goes into working the land and creating a product, but there's so much joy and then nourishing people with that product, and so it's like, there is, not to say that people should have traumatic lives in any way, but there's a lot of hope in the world when we're encouraging people to look at stories like this and say, like, yes, you should never have had to go through a traumatic childhood, or it does feel unfair that their father was abusive, or whatever it is in someone's particular life, but that there is so much hope to be able to have a wonderful life where you're able to turn that into something that has purpose and that has perspective.
And to remember that you get to write your own story.
Yeah.
Like, I know that sounds maybe cliche, but I mean it truly. Like,
Yeah.
to let trauma win is to let trauma write your story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I
Like, and
do.
I
I
guess
mean, I
I,
do.
I choose the other door. I choose door number three,
Yeah.
where people get to write their own story.
Yeah.
And to me, that's whatever. Yeah, like, I'm not a big fan of like letting those things win. And if it becomes for me a story about trauma, right? And not making something, or it becomes not as like, then it feels like that's the thing that owns the narrative.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I
trauma
feel like
seems to
that's like
own
the
enough
interesting
already.
shift that's finally starting to happen with parenting now. I mean, obviously,
Yes.
I'm very aware of all that stuff having a child now, but like, we there was this phase that I'm so glad is starting to end, of like the gentle parenting where like the trauma always won, kind of,
Right.
and that everybody was defined by their trauma and that they had to carry
Right.
their trauma and label
Right.
themselves with their trauma, and like that they were never going to escape it because it was their trauma. And it was like, that's not a functional way to live, nor
No,
is it a joyful way to live.
no.
It doesn't, you should never negate what actually happened, but to be
Person.
able to digest it and to work to find purpose, to find meaning, to be able to grow stronger because of it, you know, um, I feel like it's encouraging that I think it seems like the sort of cultural zeitgeist of parenting is leaning back toward a place of like, oh, we need to say like, yes, bad things happen, and how do we shift into making sure that those bad things don't continue to happen and that we can, continue growing and being strong, and functioning in the world.
100%. Yeah,
Um,
and I think too, like, I don't want to be sound, I don't know, like a conspiracy theorist or something super wacky, but I think when we let things like that win, we paralyze ourselves.
mm,
And anytime I think of paralyzing ourselves, I think of that equates inaction. And when I
yeah.
think of inaction, I think of other forces that be winning, and the little guy suffering. And I guess that's just not the game I want.
No, I mean, it's not a pleasant way to live either, I
No,
mean,
no.
it's everyone's degree of suffering is relative, right? But it's, we've all been through stuff, and, it's just interesting to see like what the ingredients are that cause certain people to go, okay, here's the hard thing that happened, and here's how it's never going to happen again, and here's how I'm going to grow because of it. And some people just get crushed by it, and
Really.
under the totally similar circumstances, and who's to say if that's
Legit.
nature or nurture, or like who people are inherently, or I don't know, but I am with you in terms of like my personality is how do I turn that into something to grow from or to be stronger
Really.
because of, it's like, I mean, this is not about trauma at all. So I'm not negating the intensity of trauma, but like, for me, I often get asked like, um, well, wasn't it hard coming up as a female filmmaker before, people really cared about women directing, or isn't there a double standard and all these things? And yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, that's true. Like I had to reprove myself so many more times. I had to prove something 10 times over before someone believed the one time a man could have done the same thing, and everybody would have been like, oh my God, of course he can do that. And I could either get upset about that and I could spiral in that, or I could put a chip on my shoulder over it. Or I could go, you know what? It made me better. I had just had to
Yeah.
be better. And it's just better to be better.
It
You know,
is
like
just better to
if
be
the
better.
challenge is going to be that I have to be even better than I thought I had to be able to prove that I can do the thing or that I can continue to do the thing or be the person that can be relied on or be the person who has the vision, then I'd rather be better. So like I'm not going to resent that double standard. That double standard has made me a better filmmaker. It's made me a better person.
Or rather, maybe you can hold both things simultaneously. Maybe you can't resent it, but you use it as fuel, you
Right.
know?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's not a resentment that paralyzes you.
Right.
It's a
Exactly.
resentment that like fuels you,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And I think that like it's an energy that
Yeah,
you're
it's
using.
like, yeah, it becomes a challenge as opposed
Yes,
to like a chip, you know.
impediment. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, we could talk about this forever, and I'm realizing our time is up. So I'm going to ask you my favorite last question, which is, is there some advice that you were ever given, whether it's life or about writing or whatever, that you feel like would be worthy to share with other people, that like just one kernel of something that has stuck with you that's gotten you through either a hard time or through insecurities with your work or the challenge of starting something, anything like that.
Yeah. Um, to be honest, like the one that is brightest, that shines brightest at the moment, is sort of a larger piece and it pertains to this book finally kind of being done and being out in the world. And as I was writing my thank yous, this writer, her name is Renee Gladman. And I've asked her over the years for letters of recommendation for certain things like fellowships or graduate school. And for the graduate school, in the last, 3 years or so, she wrote me and she said, Nora, don't get a PhD. You want to write and you'll go into this program and I know you're worried about money.
Mm,
Um, but you want to write and you need to just do that.
yeah.
And honestly, I thought, yeah, like that's it. I mean, it's sort of what people say when they stand up there and grab their Oscar, like that maybe you think it can never happen for you, because it hasn't happened yet, or to stick with it.
Yeah.
But it's true. If it's the thing you want, right?
Yeah. You have to be honest with yourself about if it really is the thing.
Yes, I think that's the key, right? And it is always the thing I've always wanted. And it definitely was the thing that was right in front of me that took me, at least through undergraduate to finally get that it was the thing I wanted.
Mm, yeah.
But then when I found it, it's always just been a struggle, which is life, right? Like you really do their thing. Like you need to buy food and, we're always moving around or for work,
Yeah.
whether it's out of the country or different parts of the country. Things are in storage. Like it doesn't matter, but lots of that
Yeah.
displacement. But I know that this is what I want.
Yeah. That's great. Well, thank you so much for talking with us. This was
Thank
such an
you.
enlightening conversation.
Thank you so
I
much
mean,
for
about the
having me.
book, but also just about life, which I really appreciate. So,
I appreciate you too.
so yeah, so whenever the next one comes, no pressure and no, time limit here.
Okay.
We would love to have you back.
Well,
So
I would love to be a part of this community again. You're
great.
really like you're really doing something special.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that. Sometimes I'm like, am I just talking to the ether?
You might be, but there are people in
I mean, the numbers don't say I'm talking to the ether, but sometimes alone in my little cavernous office, I'm like, do people hear this? I don't know.
there. Now that the living room has become a playroom.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. The whole house is a playroom. But I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll get to talk soon.
That sounds great. Thank you, Jennifer.